Okay, if we look at our code now, our front controller is now very concise. It bootstraps our autoloader, instantiates our request, which again is pulling all of our get and server and post variables into an object-oriented wrapper. We're including our configuration for this particular application, which is just our routes. We're instantiating the framework, and then we're building up our response and sending it. That's all our front controller is doing, so it's going to be pretty easy to create multiple front controllers if we need to. Our framework is also really simple. We're basically just setting up several different objects that we need to use as dependencies for other objects. Now there's a downside to wrapping this all in this constructor here because now we don't really have access to these objects anymore. If we wanted to adjust the settings in some of them or use some of their methods, we would have to create wrappers for those inside of our framework and access them through our front controller. That seems okay, but it seems a little bit inefficient. All of these objects are well wrapped in their object orientation. They've exposed certain parts of their code to the API, so we know what methods we should be able to access and which ones we can't. So it would be nicer to just access them directly. One ugly way we can do this is by globalizing all of these objects. For example, in our front.php file or the top of our framework.php file, we could simply set all of these variables up above, and then whenever we want to use them, use the global keyword. Doing this would solve the problem of being able to access those, but it would create all sorts of other problems that we've been trying to avoid almost from the beginning. By having global variables, we're not defining exactly how they should be used. We don't have an interface for them. We just basically put them out there and say, okay, go for it. And sometimes they'll end up being used in ways that weren't intended. Also, by moving those dependencies into global variables, it's going to make it harder to unit test these different components. So what's the solution? Well, the solution is to create a dependency injection container, which almost does the same thing as globalizing different objects, but instead of globalizing them, it wraps them up in a set of methods. And this has a further advantage of instead of instantiating all of our objects all the time, regardless of whether they get used or not, a dependency injection container allows you to instantiate an object just when you need it. So it's a lot like autoloading. Again, the advantage of that is that you don't have all this code being included in various parts of your apps that don't get used and just take up memory. So it's a good model. And Symfony provides a component just for the dependency injection container. Now again, you don't need the container in order to inject dependencies. We've been injecting dependencies all the way through this series. When we create a context and then pass that context into the URL matcher, we're dependency injecting right here.